Alright, YouTube, time for Occult video number 32 on subjects like CERN, HAARP, things of that nature. I keep getting people asking me about my thoughts of what goes on at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, what HAARP pertains to, and things of that nature. I figured it would probably be best to discuss it in terms of the spiritual, because people who are asking me about this or who have concerns about the existence of such experimentation and other things as well most often appear to have those concerns because of their spiritual background. It's much like the RFID chips. I think it would be a waste of the government's time to do so, even for malevolent tracking purposes, because of the existence of smartphones. I think as far as CERN goes, CERN is a very interesting experimental platform to study particles and things of that nature. One thing people don't appear to quite understand: the sort of collisions that happen at CERN when they're injecting particles into the accelerator and smashing them together and doing other research there. The sort of particle smashing that goes on happens in nature. They're not doing anything at CERN really that isn't replicated elsewhere out there in the cosmos, within the body of stars, between various bodies. The interaction of particles in a general sense goes on all the time. And so when people are worried, oh, they're going to create a black hole that will, the CERN will blow up and, most of the region will be destroyed, or a black hole will suddenly suck the whole planet into it and we'll just all die instantly, or fall into another dimension, or will puncture the equilibrium of all existence, and a vacuum metastability event will quickly plunge absolute zero below its current recognized level, and everything will just turn into basically non-existent particulate soup. When people have these concerns, what they're not understanding is nothing specifically is going on at CERN that doesn't happen elsewhere on even larger scales every single second of every single day out there in the cosmos, within stars, black holes, things like that. Yes, CERN is capable of creating an extremely short-lived black hole, the kind that quickly collapses in on itself because it refills with matter and is not capable of holding itself together. It's certainly a little bit different from a supermassive black hole floating out there in space, gobbling up an entire galaxy over the course of a billion years. Two totally different things. And because these things happen in nature, the only difference with something like CERN is that it's being studied under laboratory conditions. These interactions happen in nature, but we can't really read anything into them. We can't discover much about those collisions because they're taking place, a million miles away, or they're taking place even here on Earth, but not under conditions in which we can actually test what's going on in the absence of outside interference. By generating these extreme magnetic fields and smashing these particles together, we can do that right here on Earth. It's very expensive. I think it costs millions of dollars to run a single one of these experiments, but already we're making leaps and bounds in the field of physics. As far as HAARP goes, of course they variously refer to it essentially as weather radar or something of that nature. HAARP is a little bit more possibly conspiratorial in nature, I suppose you could say, as to controlling the weather. People continued to blame HAARP for every natural disaster that has ever occurred well after it had been decommissioned. It's now been put back into use. I believe it's a totally different agency now using it. But if you look back at the past, specifically after sort of the rebirth of science in the wake of the Dark Ages and Renaissance into the Enlightenment and then the Industrial period especially, we're talking 1800s and so forth, sort of the Mary Shelley, Frankenstein years and up, people have worried continuously for over a century about science and how scientists were playing God, and their experiments would create races of monsters, or God would get angry, or we would accidentally destroy the planet, or aliens would come and destroy us. All of these different things. The same fear is there. It simply changes over time as the technology changes. There were legitimate concerns over a century ago that mad scientists would create sort of monsters out of pieces of dead tissue and unleash them upon the world to try to control it or something like that. It was never a sensible fear to have. There was never any possibility with the technology that existed then, especially of it happening. It would have been a very slow, time-consuming, and rather retarded way to try to take over the world. But people were worried about that nonetheless. People have been worried about RFID chips now for over a decade. Back during the Bush years, people were saying, oh, pretty soon, within the next year or so, we'll all have the mark of the beast and the Antichrist will be here. Well, it never happened, specifically because it would be ridiculous to do so. It wouldn't make any sense. Such a system, if implemented, would fail. It would. People, they're going to rely on people's smartphones to track them, at least until they have something more stable than that, which it's a privacy incursion. I do definitely oppose the use of such techniques to try to track anybody that they don't have a specific legal, honest-to-goodness, constitutionally mandated warrant for tracking. But at the same time, is it some sort of mark of the beast system whereby people can't function? No, I don't even believe in revelation, but let's argue devil's advocate and say I did. People also claimed that social security numbers and barcodes at their respective times of being used, 70s with barcodes, earlier, I believe just pre-World War II with social security cards. People claim those were the mark of the beast. Now, the funny thing is that the American Protestants that fixated on these things don't seem to understand. Those were American systems that were being put into place. They weren't in use elsewhere in some of these cases. There are still places in the world today where you're not really going to find barcodes. You don't even necessarily have electricity to use the devices necessary to read them. You go to Papua New Guinea or the middle of the Amazon or something. I don't think that you're going to find many barcodes around there. Certainly not going to find government-issued ID cards in some of these remote rural cultures either. So their idea of some all-encompassing political force, which they always seem to refer to it either as a political force or a theocratic force, coming and foisting these things on the world. I'm just not concerned about such things. Because people have made the claim before. Many of the people who made the progenitor claims about such systems are long dead. And they died long before any such thing happened. It never has happened. People are so concerned right now about privacy and self-defense, it'd probably revolt if it did happen. So I don't see it anywhere near us on the horizon, at least for the time being. As far as the scientific experiments go, people have always had a fear of what they do not understand. When Darwin first comes around, when natural selection is first proposed, when the theory of evolution is first formulated, people were up in arms. People were extremely concerned about such a thing. They thought it would topple the entire social order of the world, that the mere existence of such a theory, whether or not it was taken as credible, would throw all of science into an uproar, that it would cause the rapid degeneration of world society. It did not happen. The degeneration of society that has actually happened is largely due to the concept of multiculturalism, destroying the third world by giving them brain drain, destroying the first world by causing rises in crime, and by destroying established social orders. But it has nothing to do with evolution. In fact, most of the evolutionists were a bunch of eugenicists. For the most part, they would have opposed such a thing, which I find very funny. People are very afraid of what goes on at CERN. I think one thing that the people at CERN did, and I have to assume this is an effort to troll people, above all else, they put the statue of Shiva up right in the middle of the Collider's sort of central grounds, the ornate parks and gardens right in the middle of the Collider. Probably not the best choice of a deity to have used, considering what Shiva represents in the Hindu pantheon as being sort of destruction, related also to cycles of existence, sort of the movements of the yugas and the coming of destruction at the end of a particularly nasty part of the cycle. My thought is, I think that they were trying to make a reference to cycles because the Collider is round. Things are literally revolving around this sort of cyclical machine. in order to discover some sort of essence to existence, the Higgs boson and so forth. I think that's what they were going for. I think they probably should have chosen some other deity, because that alone has people naturally afraid because of the imagery associated now with CERN by all of these different people. That was a misstep on their part. I'm not sure why they did that. Probably the director of CERN's a Hindu, who knows. As far as HAARP goes, does it control the weather? Such a thing is possible, theoretically speaking at least. We already, we seed clouds. We do all sorts of things. People have talked about stopping tornadoes by putting up like 100-foot cement walls all over the southeast and into the Midwest to try to sort of destroy the air patterns associated with the tornadic activity. I think that's probably a bad idea. I think that might have an effect upon the local wildlife and also have unforeseen consequences with regards to the weather. But I mean, even, the location of a fairly small pond affects the weather, 10, 20 miles away in some cases, depending on the way that the wind happens to generally move in an area and the atmospheric conditions and the climate. Yeah, I'm sure with more experimentation, probably we can learn to control the weather fairly effectively. But I think it's the equivalent of putting a straw into the bathtub and, drawing out a few mouthfuls of water or something like that. The overall effect will still be fairly minute in terms of the whole world's climate, in terms of all weather movement. You've got to understand, humans, because of our perspective, neighborhood dog, humans, because of their perspective, being where, each individual one of us is tiny compared to the world at large, we look around ourselves at our human habitations in our local area and we say, what an effect we have upon the world. You look at it from space, you realize that effect is not quite so vast after all. Even when you're flying in an airplane, for those of you who have flown, when you take off or when you're about to land and you're sort of up in the sky but you can still see below you because you're below the clouds, you see, yes, there are plenty of lights from man-made activity. There's a skyscraper, there's a highway, there's a car or something, but from up there the cars look like ants. The highways look like blades of grass. We're really rather small after all. And I like to think that humans have less of a capability to affect the world around them, let alone the cosmos, than most people believe. So I do not think CERN is a threat. I think that the interactions that go on there, if they were a threat, they already would have reared their head and it would have already blown up. I think the worst thing that could happen with CERN is they lose control of one of these injections, and the whole collider does go sky high with the force of a nuclear weapon. It would devastate the collider. Everybody at the collider would be dead. The local regions would get showered with fiery, red-hot debris. But would it end the world? Ultimately, no. It would be no worse than most other major man-made accidents. HAARP, I don't believe that HAARP is capable truly of controlling the weather. I think it's used for what they say it's used for, mainly because it seems to me that if you were trying to control the weather of the world, you were trying to do something that drastic, whether you're designing it as a weapon or a way to increase your economy, whatever you happen to be using it for. It seems rather odd that they would have, the website and the nice big parking lot, and it would be very out in the open, sort of publicly viewable. It makes very little sense. I would think it would be more like Area 51. There'd be a total no-go zone for miles around, and it would be ultra secretive. Now, maybe it's some sort of reverse psychology thing, but I'm not seeing how some antennae can really control the weather. We're barely getting to the point where we can control much more minute reactions, really. We're still in the infancy of our understanding about many of these scientific things. When people are afraid of them, it's usually because they don't understand them. Like I said, at CERN, people fear CERN because they don't understand. They don't have the knowledge that many of these interactions go on in nature all the time. They do not create black holes. They do not cause vacuum metastability events. They don't cause anything like that. They're simply particle collisions. The only difference is now we can actually take a reading of what's going on, sort of observe what's going on, draw conclusions, and further our science. With HAARP, Weather control, maybe. Okay, I suppose that's a possibility. Or maybe it's just weather monitoring. Or maybe it's one of a million. Maybe it's a giant shortwave factory. I don't know. It doesn't really ultimately matter, though. It's like UVB 76. People kept saying, oh, well, it's a dead hand system hooked to the Russian nukes. It's this, it's that. The best guess, though, is that it's constantly reading the ionosphere and patched into a bunch of other shortwave systems to sort of tweak the broadcast to make sure they can be heard more easily. So yeah, relevancy to numbers stations, absolutely. Beyond that sort of spooky Halloweenish stuff, though, fairly mundane. It's a scientific station. They did abandon the old station, which was kind of strange. They did it in the middle of the night without, telling anyone, yeah, we're moving. That's a little odd. Moved it, I believe, further from the Baltic border. Maybe they were worried about World War III. Possible. But I'm not afraid of such things. Because when I see people's fear about these things, especially when you look at depictions like in Hollywood of sort of what we consider modern science causing a problem, we think of, oh, well, CERN really did open up a portal to demons or something. It looks a lot like the imagery from near a century ago with the first sort of moving pictures. You have the Frankenstein, the Wolfman and stuff, creature from the Black Lagoon, where science or scientists somehow they stumble upon some ancient ruin and mummy comes after them. They go into some unexplored location and monsters are there. They, tinker with the wrong machine and aliens come down. Something, or some mad scientist is trying to take over the world, or has an immortality fetish or something. It's the same imagery, it's just been updated, really is how I see it. So I don't see those fears as being particularly valid. Some more than others. Yeah, CERN probably could overheat and blow up. I suppose that's a possibility. The statue they chose to put there, I'm sure, was probably a grand effort at trolling people, making them concerned. Beyond that, no. I don't really have any fear of CERN or HAARP or any of these things. It's like Area 51. Do you have a fucking clue what's going on there? Maybe they do have aliens in the freezer, or maybe they're just testing top secret craft there. I don't care, ultimately. So far, it hasn't suddenly released a plume of radioactive ash, or a bunch of flying saucers with swastikas on them with, a deep German voice commanding everyone to obey the remechanized Adolf Hitler or something, so I'm not too afraid of such things. The fact that people can't understand them makes them uneasy, but then again, all of the knowledge, especially related to something like CERN, it's publicly reviewable. You can learn about these particle interactions yourself on your free time. It's just people choose not to. They'd rather have this sort of fear fetish, which I find largely detrimental. Especially, it's when occultists are doing it, it's even worse because they should know better. They have more of a breadth of philosophy and alchemy and things like that. They understand generally revelation is steganographic. The end is not coming in the way the Judeo-Christians say it will. If anything, it'll probably be man-made, not cosmic or divine. And so when they get into the sort of CERN, HAARP, whatever stuff, a little bit unnerving to me, a little bit annoying. That's about all. Peace out.